Hello, everyone. We're Group 8 from CM Lit 153 at Penn State University, and we are discussing the novel Shipwrecked Body.
Anna Clavel, who's the author of the story, is from Mexico City, where the book takes place, and she studied Latin American literature in the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where she's also interested in a lot of gender and identity issues. This is very apparent in all the work she's done. Clavel has also received some acknowledgement for her works when her novel Desire in Its Shadow was a finalist in the Primero Internacional Alfaguara. In the book, Shipwrecked Body, it's a fairly recent novel, so the issues of gender relate to some types of feminism we talked about during class. When the main character, Antonia, wakes up as a man, it relates to the radical feminism because it questions gender roles and draws lines between biologically determined behavior and the culturally determined behavior and how Antonia has to deal with that.
Shipwrecked Body starts out with the exposition when Antonia wakes up as a man. This shocking revelation leads Antonia to immediately question what exactly just happened to her. It also leaves the reader on the edge of their seat because of the new person Antonia has just become. Living in this new body of hers, Antonia must start to figure out how to go about her life in a man's body. One of the first experiences in public with this new body, Antonia runs into Francisco, an old friend of hers. Oddly enough, Francisco recognizes her in this new body. This was surprising to me and the group because I would have thought that people would have a tough time recognizing her now that she's in a man's body.
The point at which the story is told is third-person limited. The author shows us thoughts and storyline from Antonia's mind and life.
Yeah, I noticed that we get to see into Antonia's mind and get a feel of how her brain works as a man and as a woman. This was similar, I thought, to deconstructing Harry because in this work we are also able to analyze Harry's psyche as we do Antonia's.
The author uses narrative techniques in a unique way by using footnotes to fictionalize the narrator.
Yes, that was a technique championed by Borges. It was born out of his misattributions of real works to fictional authors. His influence is quite apparent throughout the novel. The different motifs she uses, including the labyrinth, and the idea of the knight or warrior wandering into the labyrinth, braving through shadows, meaning uncertainty and the risk of death, hoping to find its minotaur setter, which is to say order, are some of Borges' most famous motifs.
Yeah, Anna Clavel purposely makes the narrator a female to show the reader that we typically imagine narrators as males, and in the Spanish version of the novel, she uses la narradora, which indicates a female narrator. On page 77 and 104, there are examples where the narrator is speaking to the reader with another storyline.
This reminds me of the way most novels are when women are taught to read as men, where the narrator just assumes the role of a male and the reader just has to go along with it. But in this book, we are experiencing Antonia's gender struggle along with her as the novel progresses. So the narrator switches back and forth between a male point of view and a female point of view.
The speech and dialogue of the novel is very conversation-like, however, it can get very vulgar. For example, on page 45 to 46, Antonia and Carlos are in a steam room with other guys. The joke that one man makes about the dad and the daughter and the son is very inappropriate, but also demonstrates how the boys talk or stereotypically talk.
I noticed this too. Clavel frequently uses very vulgar and descriptive language. This reminded me once again of deconstructing Harry because Harry often talked about sex in the same manner. Both works discuss sex often and openly. However, I noticed that Antonia does it in order to fit in and explore her new life, whereas Harry uses this language out of disrespect of women.
Speaking of the exploration of a new life, Clavel portrays Antonia's new life as normal as possible to the reader. Although the audience members experience her transformation with her as she evolves from a woman to a man personally and through a first-person perspective, the life of Antonia to the outside world seems relatively normal. Because Anton's atmosphere is unaware of her hidden transformation, she lives his life as a typical citizen. In other words, the space and setting throughout the film is natural. The reader is following this character through her everyday routines. We, as readers, experience the normal bar scenes, party life, museum visits, and sex encounters of what an everyday person, male or female, would experience in their daily lives. From the time she wakes up in the morning till the moment he lays his head down at night, the reader follows the life of Antonia in a relatable manner. Had the sexual transformation not occurred, it would seem as though the audience was simply following the life of an everyday male, not to be questioned or disturbed.
All right. Playing off this point, the rising action builds up after the original interaction with Francisco when the book talks about Antonia's adjustment into her new body. Antonia ends up leaving her job because having to deal with the people in her new body at the workplace would almost be impossible. The intense fascination with urinals begins shortly after Antonia starts to hang out with Francisco, Carlos, and Raimundo.
The language during the novel is very descriptive and pays attention to a lot of details. For example, on page 42, Claudia is described with every detail brought forth. It reads, quote, "She had a splendid figure and was wearing a red dress, simple and elegant in front, but whose sole adornment could only be appreciated from behind, a slit that extended from the nape of her neck to the bottom of her back," end quote. And on page 20, urinals are explored, like at many places in the novel. It reads, "Water flowed quietly around the contours according to the mechanism of gravity and fluidity that Antonia found erotic. The abandonment to the force of will not are one, the loss of oneself in the dark hole of the most absolute dissolution. Then, as she looked into the drain, she smelled the intense odor emanating from the inner walls, a wave sour and corrosive, but also sweet that took her breath away," end quote. This minute detail that Antonia paid attention to is what gave her secret away to Raimundo. On page 134, Raimundo tells Antonia, quote, "Later, I figured out by your fascination with urinals, only a woman could look at them like you do, discerning the hunger of desire, our absolute sex, that which leaves us craving, stupefied, our true mystery for which the essential isn't in the answer, but in its interrogating gaze," end quote.
Now let's talk about emotions and sexual experiences that demonstrate the climax in Antonia's life. She's dealing with the emotions of who she is attracted to and what love is like. She meets Claudia, Malva, and Paula, who are females that Antonia starts to feel an attraction to. This feeling of attraction, as you can imagine, would be quite frightening to someone that is in a new body that has never shown an attraction to the female sex. Claudia was the first woman that Antonia had a physical experience with in her new body. The experience shared with Claudia was a frightening one for Antonia because when they were about to have sex, Antonio could not maintain an erection. This was just one of the many new adjustments that Antonio had to deal with. Malva was the first woman Antonio ever had sex with as a man. Unfortunately for Antonia, this relationship did not work out the way she planned. Personally, the most shocking part of the climax was Antonia's sexual experience with Raimundo. The sex with Raimundo was described as violent when she stated, "She knew that sex between men is, above all, violent." Shortly after the experience, Antonio and Raimundo lived their lives as the friends they were before this occurred.
Urinals are by far the most important, most prominent motif in the novel. The idea behind it is simple enough, that they resemble vaginas, and it's quite in good taste once you get over any initial skepticism for it. The reason being that it's honest. She has no ulterior motive. There's no effort to be feminist or promote the cause. The recurrence of urinals just shows how foreign yet oddly familiar the experience of using them would be from a woman's point of view.
Shipwrecked Body is also very open when talking about gender roles, and sexuality, since that is the main focus point. Another work which has a focal point of gender and sexuality is Laramie Project. Both of these pieces talk about topics in such a very personal and casual way. In Shipwrecked Body, because we are allowed to see into Antonia's mind, her ideas and conversations with friends are open to us and make the readers feel included. As with Laramie Project, the interviewers used the raw material of the interviewed people, which gave it a personal feeling. None of their opinions had been tampered with, and they were allowed to present their ideas as if they were having a conversation with the reader.
Yes, gender is definitely the main theme, the only theme, it could be argued. Clavel's notion of what is male is quite remarkable. The center of masculinity, she sees nothingness, a void, nihilism, and the rest of the motifs, the labyrinth, the night, shadows, feed off of this notion. Her ability to transport to that place was impressive, especially so once you're hit with a memorable ending. Besides the thrill of feeling like a second climactic peak, in the end, Antonia perseveres through the shadows and finds the center of her labyrinth. And sure, some readers might not be convinced, and for good reason. Perhaps leaving the question of whether or not she finds her center to the reader's imagination was the appropriate way to go about it. At the very least, it would have been more in touch with reality, and certainly more believable. After all, the nature of the knight's odyssey through the labyrinth, what fuels it, is that we don't know if there is a center or not. It's the reason why, according to the legend of the Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth, the women anxiously wait outside for the knight or warrior. The uncertainty of the shadow, of not knowing if there is a center in the labyrinth, or a minotaur to be slain for that matter, is represented by women in this legend, but is a feeling we all have, whether we're aware of it or not. In fact, if we had to point out something in the novel and label it feminist, even if it deserves the higher titles of art, expression, or something beautiful, it could be the idea that it is women who are more consciously aware of the fundamental dilemma between chaos and certainty that we as human beings face. That women see both sides of the coin while men are doomed to seek order. Perhaps Clavel's choice to let Antonia find her center, is better interpreted as a wish she, meaning Clavel, holds dearly.
The tone of the novel is very confused. The very first part of the novel, she wakes up as a male, which to most people would be very confusing thought process and completely shocking. Antonia is curious and still attracted to men. Other tones include fear and uncertainty. During the entire novel, Antonia is weary that people will figure out her secret. This is evident during the scene in the steam room. Antonia becomes cautious, and Clavel writes, quote, "An inappropriate gesture might make her a suspect in their eyes," end quote, page 45.
Speaking of uncertainty in this novel, we can talk about the following action that starts with the introduction of Paula into the story. Antonio has dealt with many emotions up to this point, but when Paula fell into his life, it happened at the perfect time. Paula is different than the other females she has dealt with up to this point. Antonio starts to show real signs of love with Paula, which has not been present in his previous relationships. She actually works up the nerve to confess to Paula that she was once a woman. Paula took this confession by surprise, but did not act as if they were going to break up just because of it. Unfortunately, Paula tells Antonio that she was leaving soon for Italy. Once Paula leaves, she does not hear from her for quite some time, which leads to bleak thoughts of uncertainty from Antonia.
Another parallel I saw with Shipwrecked Body was Tootsie. Antonia and Tootsie both go through life-changing events in their respective works. Both characters are forced to look at life in a new way and take on a new perspective. A difference that I noticed, though, was Tootsie's journey occurred as an effect of his actions, while Antonia's journey is the result of an uncontrollable force, which makes Antonia the submissive piece in the occurrence of the transitions.
Finally, the novel's resolution starts with a phone call from Paula. Paula asks Antonia to come visit her in Italy, which he immediately agrees to. Also at this time, you see a break amongst the characters. Everyone decides to go their own separate ways. Raimundo finds a woman in the Yucatan that he wants to be with, so he leaves Mexico at that point. Antonio arrives in Italy and is happily greeted by Paula. The story comes to an end while Antonio and Paula are on a boat, which has a positive tone to the conclusion. It is not presented that Paula and Antonio end up together after the trip to Italy, but there is a good indication that they could end up together.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on A Shipwrecked Body, and I hope you enjoyed how we explored gender in the novel by Anna Clavel.